My wife's mother toasted. To the family I'm proud of, not you, John. Everyone laughed. Then the waiter put the $3,980 bill, sat heavy in front of me. My wife just smirked while everyone waited. I stood up and the whole room went silent. My name is John Mercer, and let me tell you something right off the bat. Marrying into Claudia's family was like voluntarily signing up to be the human punching bag at a boxing gym. From day one, I felt like that awkward cousin who shows up to Thanksgiving dinner uninvited, except I actually was invited. Hell, I was married to the damn princess of the castle. Claudia's mother, Margaret, had this special talent for making me feel about as welcome as a fart in an elevator. The woman could have written a masterclass on passive-aggressive warfare. She'd look at me with this smile that was colder than a witch's tit in January, all while gushing over her precious golden children, Victor and Elise. Those two could have burned down an orphanage, and Margaret would have found a way to spin it as entrepreneurial spirit or creative expression. Family dinners at the Kingston estate, because of course they had to call it an estate instead of just a big-ass house, were like watching a live performance of How to Make Your Son-in-Law Feel Like Absolute Dog Shit. The dining room was one of those pretentious affairs with crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than my truck and a table long enough to land a small aircraft on. Margaret would sit at the head like some discount queen, holding court while I got relegated to what I liked to call Siberia, the far end where the lighting was dim and the conversation somehow never quite reached. So Victor, Margaret would coo, cutting into her perfectly prepared salmon like she was performing surgery. How's that new development project coming along? And Victor, that smug bastard, would launch into this elaborate tale about his latest real estate venture, dropping numbers like confetti at a New Year's party. Well, Mother, we're looking at a potential 7-figure return on the Riverside property. The investors are practically throwing money at us. Meanwhile, I'd be sitting there thinking about how I spent my morning unclogging Mrs. Henderson's toilet because her grandson flushed his action figures down the drain. Not exactly investment portfolio material, you know? Then it was Elise's turn to shine. Oh, and Elise, Margaret would practically purr. I saw the write-up about your boutique in that magazine. Such innovative designs. Elise would giggle, and I mean actually giggle like she was still in high school, while describing her latest fashion venture that probably involved selling $30 scarves to housewives with too much time and money. And what did I get? If I was lucky, I'd catch Margaret's attention long enough for her to ask, "And John, how's that contracting?" The way she said contracting made it sound like I was in the business of spreading sexually transmitted diseases instead of, actually building things that people needed. "It's going well, Mrs. Kingston," I'd always reply, because what else was I supposed to say? That I'd landed 3 major renovation projects this month and was booked solid through the next season? That my ordinary job was actually keeping food on our table and gas in Claudia's BMW? Hell no. Margaret had this way of making my successes feel like participation trophies at a kindergarten sports day. The worst part? Claudia would sit there through all of this with this little smirk on her face, like watching her family roast me was better entertainment than cable television. She'd catch my eye sometimes and give me this look that said, "Isn't this fun?" Fun, right. About as fun as a root canal performed by a drunk dentist with shaky hands. I kept telling myself it was just family dynamics, you know? Every family has their weird shit. Maybe the Kingstons were just upper-crust people who didn't know how to relate to us regular folks. Maybe Margaret was just protective of her daughter and needed time to warm up to me. Maybe pigs would sprout wings and start doing aerial acrobatics. But the truth was eating at me like acid on metal. I'd lie in bed next to Claudia, staring at the ceiling of our modest 2-bedroom apartment, the one I paid for, by the way, and wonder what the hell I'd gotten myself into. Was this what marriage was supposed to feel like? This constant sense that you're auditioning for a role you'll never actually get? My buddies at work tried to tell me straight, "John, man, you're getting played harder than a fiddle at a bluegrass festival," Tommy would say while we were loading materials into the truck. "That family's using you like a personal ATM machine." And Dave, our crew chief, would shake his head and mutter about how no woman was worth that kind of disrespect, no matter how good she looked in a cocktail dress. But here's the thing about love, or what I thought was love at the time. It makes you stupid as hell. You convince yourself that enduring the bullshit is somehow noble, like you're a martyr for the cause of matrimony. You tell yourself that proving your worth means taking whatever garbage they throw at you with a smile and a "thank you, sir, may I have another?" So I kept showing up to those dinners, kept sitting in Siberia, kept listening to Margaret's subtle digs about my quaint little business and Claudia's not-so-subtle hints that maybe I should network more with Victor's crowd. I kept writing checks for dinners I didn't order, picking up tabs for people who wouldn't piss on me if I was on fire, and pretending that being treated like the help was just part of the package deal of marrying into money. The resentment was building up inside me like pressure in a busted pipe. Every snide comment, every dismissive laugh, every time Claudia chose her family's amusement over my dignity, it all went into this growing pile of anger that I kept shoving down deeper and deeper. I figured if I could just be patient enough, work hard enough, prove myself worthy enough, maybe one day I'd earn my place at that fancy table. What a joke that turned out to be. If you want to understand the Kingston family dynamic, picture this. It's like watching a twisted game show where Victor and Elise are the contestants who always win, and I'm the guy in the audience they occasionally throw peanuts at for entertainment. The favoritism in this family wasn't just obvious. It was so blatant it might as well have been written in neon lights and hung over the front door. Let me paint you a picture of how deep this rabbit hole went. Victor, the golden boy with his slicked-back hair and $1,000 suits, had been riding the parental gravy train since he could walk upright. When he graduated college, barely, from what I heard through the grapevine, Margaret and Gerald bought him a brand new BMW as a congratulations gift. Not just any BMW, mind you, but one of those fancy M-series models that costs more than most people make in a year. Then, when Victor decided he wanted to flip his first house, guess who came to the rescue with a six-figure loan at 0% interest? That's right, the bank of mom and dad, open 24/7 for their precious baby boy. The kid had never swung a hammer in his life, probably couldn't tell a Phillips head screwdriver from a regular one. But suddenly he's a real estate mogul because mommy and daddy opened their checkbook. And when that first flip turned into a spectacular disaster, because surprise, surprise, hiring the cheapest contractors and cutting every corner imaginable doesn't actually work, did Victor face any consequences? Hell no. Margaret just wrote it off as a learning experience and fronted him the money for his next venture. The woman had more excuses for Victor's failures than a politician during election season. Elise wasn't any different. Princess Elise, with her perfectly straightened blonde hair and her collection of designer handbags that could have fed a small country. When she decided she wanted to open a boutique, because every rich girl with too much time on her hands thinks she's the next Coco Chanel, Margaret practically threw money at her like she was making it rain at a strip club. The boutique, which Elise had the audacity to name Eclat, because God forbid she use a regular English word, was located in the most expensive shopping district in town. The rent alone could have covered my mortgage for 6 months, but that was chump change to the Kingston family fortune. They bought her inventory, paid for her storefront renovation, even hired some hotshot interior designer to make the place look like something out of a fashion magazine. And here's the kicker. The boutique has been hemorrhaging money since day one. Turns out, selling overpriced scarves and handbags to soccer moms isn't the goldmine Elise thought it would be. But does Margaret care? Not a chance. Every month when Elise comes crying about how she's struggling to make ends meet, Margaret just slides another check across the table like it's no big deal. Meanwhile, I'm busting my ass running a legitimate contracting business, actually providing services that people need and want. I've got a solid reputation, repeat customers, and a crew of guys who depend on me for their livelihoods. But when I just mentioned, mind you, that I was looking to expand and could use a small loan to buy some new equipment and maybe hire another crew, Margaret looked at me like I'd just asked her to donate a kidney. Real men make their own luck, John, she said with that condescending smile of hers, the one that made me want to punch something. The way she said it, you'd think I was some kind of deadbeat looking for a handout instead of a guy with a solid business plan and 5 years of steady growth to back it up. So that's exactly what I did. I made my own damn luck. While Victor was playing dress-up businessman with mommy's money and Elise was pretending to be a fashion entrepreneur, I was working double shifts, taking on weekend jobs, and saving every penny I could scrape together. I lived on peanut butter sandwiches and instant coffee for months, driving a truck that was held together with duct tape and prayers. Also, I could fund my expansion myself. And you know what? I did it. Bought the equipment, hired 2 more guys, landed some major contracts. My business grew by 40% that year, all without a single dime from the Kingston family bank. But did anyone acknowledge that? Did Margaret ever say, "Gee, John, maybe I was wrong about you"? Did Claudia ever brag to her friends about her husband's success the way she bragged about Victor's latest property flip? You already know the answer to that. The real kick in the teeth was walking into their house, their goddamn mansion with its marble floors and crystal everything, and seeing the family photo gallery that ran along the main hallway. It was like a shrine to Kingston family perfection, dozens of professionally shot portraits spanning the years. There was baby Victor in his christening gown, teenage Elise at her debutante ball, Claudia graduating from that fancy private college. And then there were the family portraits, the big formal ones that probably cost more to shoot than most people spend on their wedding photos. There they were, the golden trio, Claudia, Victor, and Elise, all smiles and designer clothes, looking like they'd stepped out of the pages of Town and Country magazine. Margaret and Gerald flanked them like proud peacocks, beaming with the kind of joy that comes from knowing your children will never want for anything. And me? Well, I was there too, sort of. Standing at the edges like an afterthought, partially cropped out of most shots like I was some kind of photobomber who'd accidentally wandered into the frame. In the few pictures where I was fully visible, I looked about as comfortable as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs. The worst part was Gerald, Claudia's father. The man had about as much backbone as a chocolate eclair. I could see it in his eyes sometimes, this flash of recognition, like he knew what was happening was wrong. There were moments when Margaret would be particularly vicious with her little digs, and Gerald would shift uncomfortably in his chair, open his mouth like he might actually say something, then think better of it and look down at his plate. Gerald Kingston, captain of industry, man who'd built a fortune from nothing, reduced to a mouse in his own house, because his wife ruled the roost with an iron fist wrapped in a Hermes glove. If I ever needed a cautionary tale about what happens when you let someone walk all over you for too long, I just had to look at Gerald. Let me tell you about being the world's most expensive doormat, because that's basically what I'd turned into. I supported Claudia like she was some kind of delicate flower who'd wilt if she had to face the harsh reality of actually paying for anything herself. And I'm not talking about just splitting the rent 50-50 like normal couples do. Oh no, that would have been too simple for Princess Claudia. I covered everything, and I mean everything. Rent on our apartment? Mine. Electric bill, water bill, internet, cable, car insurance for both vehicles? All mine. Groceries, gas, that ridiculously overpriced organic face cream she absolutely had to have because some Instagram influencer said it would change her life? You guessed it. Straight out of John Mercer's wallet. But here's where it gets really fun. Claudia had this little shopping hobby that would have made a cocaine addiction look budget-friendly. The woman could drop $500 at Target and somehow convince herself she'd been saving money because she found a throw pillow on clearance. Every weekend was like Christmas morning for her. Packages showing up at our door from Amazon, Nordstrom, Sephora, and a dozen other retailers I'd never heard of but apparently couldn't live without. It was on sale, she'd squeal, pulling some designer handbag out of a box that cost more than my monthly truck payment. I saved us $200. Yeah, saved us money by spending $600 we didn't have. The mathematics of Claudia's shopping logic could have baffled Stephen Hawking. And did she ever offer to chip in? Did she ever say, "Hey honey, maybe I should get a job to help with expenses"? Hell no. Why would she work when she had her own personal ATM machine right there in the apartment, complete with a pulse and a wedding ring? But the real cherry on top of this shit Sunday was the Sunday dinner tradition. Every single week, without fail, Claudia would announce on Saturday night that we were expected at her parents' house the next day. Not invited, expected. Like it was some kind of royal decree that I couldn't possibly refuse. "We can't miss Sunday dinner," she'd say, already picking out her outfit like she was attending a state function. "Mother specifically asked about you this week." Yeah, right. Margaret asking about me was like a shark asking about the health and well-being of a wounded seal, purely professional interest. So every Sunday, I'd put on my nicest shirt, which wasn't saying much, considering my entire wardrobe could fit in one of Victor's walk-in closets. and drive us over to the Kingston estate for another exciting episode of Let's See How Uncomfortable We Can Make John. The dinners themselves were like elaborate theater productions, complete with multiple courses, fine china that probably cost more per plate than I made in a day, and conversation topics that somehow never included anything I might actually know about. They discussed their country club gossip, their charity galas, their vacation plans to places I'd never be able to afford, all while I sat there nodding like a bobblehead doll and trying not to accidentally use the wrong fork. But here's the real kicker. Somehow, someway, I always ended up paying for these little family gatherings. Not the whole bill, mind you, because that would have been too obvious even for the Kingstons. No, they had a much more sophisticated system of financial manipulation. It would start innocently enough. "John, would you mind covering the wine tonight?" Margaret would ask sweetly. I forgot to stop by the store, so I'd shell out $60 for a bottle of wine that tasted exactly like the $20 stuff to me, but apparently had some fancy French name that made it worth 3 times as much. Then it escalated. "Oh, John, could you grab the dessert on your way over? There's this wonderful bakery downtown." And suddenly I'm dropping another $40 on some pretentious cake that looked like a work of art and tasted like disappointment. Before I knew it, I was covering appetizers, covering drinks, covering the tip for the catering staff when they decided to have the dinner professionally catered because Margaret was too busy to cook. My share of these family dinners had somehow morphed into covering everyone else's drinks, desserts, and whatever other random expenses they could dream up. The math never made sense, but nobody seemed to care about that little detail. Victor would order the most expensive scotch on the menu. Elise would insist on champagne that cost more per bottle than most people spend on groceries for a week, and somehow it all ended up itemized under John's portion when the bill came. And the worst part? Nobody ever said thank you. Not once. Claudia would just smile and chat with her family like I was some kind of invisible servant whose only job was to make sure the checks cleared. Margaret would occasionally nod in my direction, the way you might acknowledge the waiter after he refills your water glass. My friends at work were starting to notice the toll this was taking. "Jesus, John," Tommy said one day when I showed up with yet another bag lunch because I couldn't afford to eat out anymore. "You look like you haven't slept in a week. And what happened to those steaks you used to bring for the crew barbecues?" How was I supposed to explain that my wife's family had turned me into their personal piggy bank? That I was working my ass off to fund their lifestyle while living on ramen noodles and generic beer? "John, man, you're being used harder than a rented mule," Dave told me straight up after I had to borrow $20 for gas to get home. "That woman's got you trained better than a circus poodle. When's the last time she paid for anything? When's the last time you bought something for yourself that wasn't absolutely necessary?" I couldn't answer him because the truth was too embarrassing. The last thing I'd bought for myself was a new pair of work boots, and even then I'd felt guilty about spending the money because Claudia had been eyeing some designer shoes that cost 10 times as much. But I kept telling myself this was what good husbands do. This was what love looked like. Sacrifice, putting your wife's needs before your own, proving your devotion through your willingness to endure hardship for her happiness. I convinced myself that my suffering was noble, that I was building something meaningful by showing the Kingston family that I could provide for their daughter. What a fucking joke that turned out to be. Margaret's 70th birthday was approaching like a freight train loaded with expensive expectations, and I could already feel my wallet crying in anticipation. The woman didn't just want a birthday party. Oh no, that would have been too pedestrian for someone of her refined tastes. She wanted what she called a celebration worthy of the milestone, which in Kingston family speak translated to, "Let's see how much money we can blow on one night while making John feel like a peasant." The venue they chose was the Grand Marcellus restaurant, and if you've never had the pleasure of stepping into that temple of pretentious dining, let me paint you a picture. This wasn't your average steakhouse or family restaurant where normal people go to celebrate special occasions. The Grand Marcellus was the kind of place where they probably charged you $50 just to look at the menu, where the waiters wore white gloves and spoke in hushed, reverent tones like they were serving communion instead of overpriced food. Walking into that place was like stepping into someone's idea of what heaven would look like if God had a serious obsession with crystal and gold leaf. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen fireworks, each one probably worth more than my annual salary. The floors were genuine marble, not that fake stuff you see in chain restaurants. but real honest-to-God Italian marble that clicked and echoed with every step like you were walking through a cathedral. The walls were covered in paintings that looked like they belonged in a museum, and knowing the Kingston family, they probably did at one point. Gilded frames, classical scenes, portraits of dead rich people who looked just as stuffy and self-important as the living rich people who frequented this place. Even the damn napkins felt like they cost more than my entire outfit. They'd reserved what the maitre d' called the Venetian room, because of course they couldn't just book a regular private dining room like normal human beings. The Venetian room was this elaborate space that looked like it had been airlifted straight out of some Italian palace. More chandeliers, more marble, more gold accents than a rapper's music video. The table was long enough to seat a small army, covered with the kind of white linen that probably required a PhD in laundry science to wash properly. And the guest list? Jesus Christ. It was like Margaret had invited everyone who'd ever appeared in the society pages of the local newspaper. Cousins, aunts, uncles, family friends, business associates, basically anyone who could serve as an audience for the Kingston family's wealth and status. I counted at least 40 people milling around the room, all of them dressed like they'd just stepped off the pages of some fancy magazine. The women were dripping in jewelry that sparkled under those chandeliers like they were competing to see who could blind the most people, their designer dresses probably costing more than most people's cars. The men wore suits that fit so perfectly they had to be custom-made, watches that could have paid for a kid's college education, and that particular brand of confidence that comes from never having to check your bank balance before making a purchase. And then there was me, sitting at what I'd mentally dubbed the kids' table, the far end of the room where they'd strategically placed the less important family members. You know, the ones who didn't have trust funds or country club memberships or summer homes in the Hamptons. I was wedged between Claudia's ancient great-aunt who kept asking me if I was still in construction, like it was some kind of temporary phase, and a cousin whose main claim to fame was marrying a guy who owned a chain of dry cleaners. I nursed my sparkling water, because of course I couldn't afford to order actual drinks at these prices, and watched the show unfold like I was observing some bizarre anthropological experiment. The laughter was too loud, too practiced, like everyone was performing their happiness for an invisible camera. Conversations flowed around topics I couldn't contribute to. Which charity gala had the best catering this year? Whose yacht was docked where for the summer? Investment strategies for their various portfolios. The photographer they'd hired, because naturally you can't have a Kingston family celebration without professional documentation, circled the room like a shark, his camera clicking constantly as he captured every precious moment of this display of wealth and status. He focused primarily on what I'd started thinking of as the Holy Trinity, Claudia, Victor, and Elise, posing them like they were celebrities at a movie premiere. "Could you three move a little closer together?" he'd direct, and they'd arrange themselves with the practiced ease of people who'd been photographed their entire lives. Smiles perfectly calibrated, poses perfectly angled, every shot designed to showcase the Kingston family's photogenic perfection. Meanwhile, I sat there feeling about as photogenic as roadkill, occasionally catching the edge of a shot when the photographer's lens swept too wide. Not that anyone would notice me in those pictures anyway. I'd learned long ago that I was basically human wallpaper at these events, present but not really seen, included but not really part of the scene. The food kept coming in waves. Appetizers that looked like tiny works of art, soups served in bowls that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, entrees that had names I couldn't pronounce and ingredients I'd never heard of. Each course was announced by the waitstaff with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious ceremonies, as if we were being blessed with the privilege of consuming these culinary masterpieces. But even as I sat there, mechanically eating food that tasted like money and watching this elaborate performance of family celebration, something inside me was starting to shift. Maybe it was the sheer absurdity of the whole situation. Or maybe it was the way Claudia kept glancing over at me with that particular look that said, "Please don't embarrass me in front of all these important people." Whatever it was, I could feel a familiar tension building in my chest, that same pressure I'd been pushing down for months now. The same resentment that had been accumulating like interest on a debt I never agreed to pay. Something was different about tonight, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly what. I just knew that the performance was about to take an unexpected turn. The moment Margaret stood up, glass in hand. I knew I was about to witness something special. Not special in a good way, mind you. More like the special kind of disaster you see coming from a mile away, but can't do anything to stop. The woman had this particular gleam in her eye, the same look a cat gets right before it drops a dead mouse on your pillow as a gift. The entire room shifted like someone had flipped a switch. Conversations died mid-sentence, forks suspended halfway to mouths. Even the photographer stopped clicking for a moment. Margaret had this effect on people. When she wanted attention, she commanded it like some kind of socialite general calling her troops to order. She was wearing this ridiculous black cocktail dress that probably cost more than my truck, dripping with pearls and diamonds like she was auditioning for the role of Rich Widow No. 3 in some daytime soap opera. Her silver hair was swept up in one of those elaborate styles that required professional intervention, and her makeup was applied with the precision of a Renaissance painter working on the Sistine Chapel. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying that particular brand of authority that comes from a lifetime of having people hang on your every word. The room fell silent except for the soft clink of crystal and the distant sound of kitchen staff preparing the next course. Even the waiters stopped what they were doing, probably sensing that they were about to witness something worth gossiping about during their smoke breaks. Margaret's smile was pure theater, wide, bright, and about as genuine as a $3 bill. She raised her champagne flute higher, and I noticed the way the crystal caught the light from those ridiculously expensive chandeliers, sending little rainbows dancing across the white tablecloth. For a split second, I actually thought she might say something nice about me. Maybe acknowledge that I'd been part of this family for 3 years now, that I'd shown up to every one of these dog and pony shows, that I'd smiled politely through countless subtle insults and passive-aggressive comments. What a naive little lamb I was. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight to celebrate this milestone with me," Margaret continued, her voice honey-sweet and dripping with false emotion. 70 years on this earth, and I can honestly say I've been blessed beyond measure. She paused for dramatic effect, like she was delivering a monologue at the local community theater. Her eyes swept across the room, taking in all the designer dresses and expensive suits, the jewelry that could have funded a small country's national debt, the faces of people who'd never known what it felt like to check their bank balance before buying groceries. This was her kingdom, her court, her moment to hold forth like the queen she'd always believed herself to be. "But most of all," she said, her voice growing stronger, more confident, "I'm grateful for my children. My beautiful, successful, accomplished children who have made me so proud." Her gaze landed on Victor first, and he straightened up like a soldier receiving a commendation from his commanding officer. Then Elise, who practically glowed under her mother's approving stare. And then those eyes found Claudia, and the pride in Margaret's voice was unmistakable. "Claudia, my darling daughter, you've grown into such a remarkable woman. Beautiful, intelligent, everything a mother could hope for." Claudia beamed like she'd just won the lottery, soaking up the praise like a sponge absorbing water. The room was eating this up, of course. Relatives nodding approvingly, friends murmuring their agreement, everyone playing their part in this elaborate production of family perfection. I could practically hear the mental notes being taken. Such a lovely family. Margaret raised such wonderful children. The Kingstons are truly blessed. But I knew what was coming. Call it intuition, call it experience, call it the sick feeling in my stomach that had been growing stronger with every passing minute. Margaret's eyes hadn't landed on me yet, but I could feel her awareness of my presence like a spider sensing vibrations in its web. "These three have brought such joy to my life," Margaret continued, her voice carrying across the room like she was addressing a crowd at a political rally. "They've achieved so much, accomplished so much, made such wonderful lives for themselves." She paused again, and this time her eyes did find mine, just for a fraction of a second. That's when I saw it, the malice hiding behind that perfectly practiced smile. The cold calculation of someone who'd been planning this moment, savoring it, building up to it like a composer preparing for the crescendo of a symphony. Margaret Kingston was about to deliver her masterpiece, and I was going to be her canvas. She raised her glass even higher, and the entire room followed suit like they were part of some choreographed dance. 40-something people holding crystal champagne flutes, All eyes on the matriarch of the Kingston family as she prepared to deliver what everyone assumed would be a touching tribute to family and love and all those other Hallmark card sentiments. "So here's to my family," Margaret announced, her voice ringing clear and strong across the marble floors and ornate walls of the Venetian room. "To the people who matter, to the ones who've earned their place at this table." The pause stretched out like a rubber band being pulled to its breaking point. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, could feel the tension building in my chest like pressure in a boiler that's been running too hot for too long. And then she dropped the hammer. "To the family I'm proud of," Margaret said, her smile never wavering, her voice never losing that sweet, honey-dripped tone. "Not you, John." The words hit me like a physical blow, not metaphorically. I mean, I actually felt the impact, like someone had sucker-punched me in the gut and knocked all the air out of my lungs. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard her. Surely she hadn't just said what I thought she'd said. Surely no one would be that cruel, that calculated, that deliberately vicious in front of 40 witnesses. But the laughter that erupted around the room confirmed what I'd heard. Not uncomfortable, nervous laughter. Genuine amusement. Like Margaret had just delivered the punchline to the world's cruelest joke. Forks clinked against crystal as people toasted to her words, celebrating my public humiliation like it was part of the evening's entertainment. The laughter was still echoing in my ears like some twisted soundtrack when the dessert course finally wrapped up. I'd been sitting there in a fog of humiliation, mechanically pushing around some ridiculously elaborate chocolate creation that probably had more ingredients than a chemistry experiment. My face felt hot, my hands were shaking slightly, and I kept replaying Margaret's words over and over in my head like a broken record. "Not you, John." The worst part wasn't even the insult itself. It was watching how everyone had reacted to it. These people, these so-called family members and friends, had laughed. Actually laughed. Like my public humiliation was the highlight of their evening. Better entertainment than whatever overpriced show they'd probably catch at the theater next weekend. Claudia was sitting next to me, acting like nothing had happened. She'd joined in the toast, clinked her glass with everyone else's, and was now chatting animatedly with her cousin about some upcoming charity luncheon. Every few minutes, she'd glance over at me with this look that was part annoyance, part warning, the same look you'd give a dog that was thinking about peeing on the carpet. I was just starting to think maybe I could make it through the rest of this nightmare without any more surprises when I saw him approaching. The waiter, a young guy, probably in his 20s, with the kind of nervous energy that comes from working in a place where the tips can make or break your monthly rent. He was carrying one of those black leather folders that every restaurant uses for presenting the check, and he was heading straight for our end of the table. For a split second, I thought maybe he was going to one of the other tables. Maybe some other poor bastard was about to get hit with the bill for this circus. But no such luck. He walked right up to me, stopping just to my left with the kind of polite, professional demeanor they probably teach in fancy restaurant training. "For you, sir," he said softly, setting the black folder directly in front of me with the careful precision of someone placing a bomb on a table. His voice was quiet, respectful, but I could see something in his eyes, sympathy maybe, or just the look of someone who'd delivered bad news before and knew what was coming next. My hands felt like they belonged to someone else as I opened the folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper, printed on the restaurant's letterhead with all the elegant fonts and gold trim that screamed, "We charge extra for everything, including the paper we print your financial ruin on." And there it was, in black and white. $3,980. $3,980. I blinked, certain I was seeing things. Maybe the stress of the evening had finally caused my brain to snap, and I was hallucinating numbers that couldn't possibly be real. But no matter how many times I looked at that paper, the total didn't change. If anything, it seemed to get bigger each time my eyes focused on it. The itemized breakdown read like a catalog of financial torture. There were charges for things I'd never heard of, much less consumed. Champagne service, $890. Premium wine selection, $640. Lobster thermidor appetizer course, $320. Wagyu beef tasting platter, $450. And that was just the beginning. They'd charged for every single bottle of that ridiculously expensive champagne that had been flowing like water all evening. Every glass of wine that Victor had knocked back while pontificating about his latest real estate venture. Every exotic appetizer that Elise had picked at while complaining about how exhausting it was to run a boutique that lost money every month. But here's the really beautiful part. They'd charge for things I hadn't even touched. That caviar service that had been passed around during cocktail hour? On my bill, even though I'd stuck to peanuts from the bar. The special dessert wine that Margaret had insisted everyone try with the chocolate course? Yep, that was mine too, apparently. I felt like I was reading the bill for someone else's life. Someone who lived in a world where dropping $4,000 on a dinner was just another Tuesday night. This had to be a mistake. This had to be some kind of accounting error that would get sorted out once I explained that I'd only ordered sparkling water and whatever the cheapest entree option was. But even as I tried to convince myself it was all a misunderstanding, I could feel eyes on me. Not just the waiter's eyes. The whole damn table was watching me now, waiting to see how I'd react to this latest development in the evening's entertainment. Margaret was leaning forward slightly, her eyes bright with the kind of predatory interest a hawk shows when it spots a wounded rabbit. That smile was still plastered on her face, but now it had an edge to it, sharp enough to cut glass. She was enjoying this, savoring every second of my discomfort like it was a fine wine. "Well," she said, her voice carrying that same honey-sweet tone she'd used for the toast. "What are you waiting for, John? The evening isn't getting any younger." The waiter shifted uncomfortably beside me, probably wondering if he was about to witness a complete mental breakdown in the middle of the Venetian room. The poor kid was just doing his job, following whatever instructions he'd been given about who was responsible for the bill. He had no idea he was a prop in this elaborate theater of family dysfunction. I could feel my pulse thundering in my ears, my chest tight with a mixture of rage and disbelief. This wasn't just about money. Though $4,000 was more than I made in a month after taxes, this was about something much deeper, much more fundamental. This was about respect, or the complete and total lack of it. "Go on, John," Margaret continued, her voice dripping with mock encouragement. "Pay it. It's the least you can do for being part of this family." The way she said "part of this family" made it clear that she considered me about as much a part of the family as the hired help. Around the table, conversations had died down to whispers and sideways glances. Relatives were pretending to be absorbed in their coffee and after-dinner drinks, but I could feel their attention like heat from a fire. Some looked uncomfortable, probably recognizing that they were witnessing something ugly. Others seemed curious, maybe even entertained by the drama unfolding in front of them. Claudia's hand found my arm, but instead of comfort, her grip felt like a warning. "Don't make a scene," she whispered, so quietly I almost didn't hear her. "Just pay it, and we can discuss this later. Just pay it." Like it was that simple. Like $4,000 was pocket change that I could throw around without a second thought. Something inside me snapped. Not in a dramatic, Hollywood movie kind of way. More like when a rubber band that's been stretched too far finally gives up and breaks with a quiet little pop. All those months of swallowing insults, all those years of being treated like a second-class citizen in my own marriage, all those Sunday dinners where I smiled and nodded while they made jokes at my expense. It all crystallized in that moment into something harder and sharper than diamond. I stood up. The movement was deliberate, controlled, nothing rushed or angry about it. But in that room full of crystal and marble and pretentious assholes, the sound of my chair scraping against the floor echoed like a gunshot. It was amazing how quickly 40 people could go from animated conversation to dead silence. Forks frozen halfway to mouths, wine glasses suspended in midair. Even the background noise from the kitchen seemed to fade away. Everyone was staring at me now, and for the first time in 3 years, I didn't give a damn. Let them stare. Let them watch the show they'd all been waiting for without even realizing it. For once, John Mercer was going to be the center of attention at a Kingston family gathering. And it wasn't going to be because someone was making fun of my job or my clothes or my lack of a trust fund. "John," Claudia hissed under her breath, her grip tightening on my arm like she was trying to anchor me to my chair through sheer force of will. "Sit down. You're embarrassing yourself." "Embarrassing myself." Right. Because standing up for yourself when you're being publicly humiliated is somehow more embarrassing than just taking it with a smile. I looked down at her. This woman I'd married. This person I'd thought I loved, and for the first time I really saw her. Not the beautiful, sophisticated woman who'd swept me off my feet 3 years ago, but the entitled princess who'd been playing me like a fiddle from day one. The look in her eyes wasn't concern or love, or even basic human decency. It was panic. Pure, undiluted panic that her carefully orchestrated world was about to come crashing down around her perfectly manicured fingernails. But it was Margaret's voice that really sealed the deal. "John, dear," she said, her tone dripping with the kind of condescending sweetness usually reserved for talking to particularly slow children. "I think you're overreacting. It's just dinner. Surely you can handle one little bill." One little bill. $4,800 was a little bill to these people. That was more than most families spend on groceries for 6 months, more than some people's entire monthly salary, and Margaret was talking about it like it was pocket change you'd drop on a cup of coffee. I looked around the table at all these faces, relatives who'd never worked a day in their lives, friends who'd inherited their wealth from daddy's business deals, people who thought roughing it meant staying at a 4-star hotel instead of a 5-star resort. They were all watching me with this mixture of curiosity and barely concealed amusement, like they were waiting to see if the dancing monkey would perform one more trick before the show ended. That's when I found my voice. "If I am not part of the family," I said, my words cutting through the silence like a knife through silk, "then I won't pay for the family." The reaction was immediate and electric. Gasps rippled around the table like I'd just announced I was running off to join the circus. Wine glasses clinked as people set them down with shaking hands. Someone, I think it was Aunt Patricia, actually clutched her pearls like she was having a Victorian-era case of the vapors. Margaret's perfectly composed facade cracked for just a moment, revealing something ugly underneath. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, probably because no one had ever had the audacity to throw her own words back at her before. In the Kingston family hierarchy, Margaret's pronouncements were treated like biblical commandments, not suggestions that could be questioned or, God forbid, rejected. "Don't embarrass us," Claudia whispered frantically, her voice tight with barely controlled hysteria. "Everyone's watching. Think about what you're doing. Think about what I was doing. I'd been thinking about what I was doing for 3 goddamn years. And where had it gotten me? Sitting at the kids' table, paying for the privilege of being insulted, treated like a walking ATM with a pulse." Victor decided this was his moment to play the big brother role. He leaned forward with that smug expression he'd probably been practicing since prep school, the one that said he was about to educate the little people about how the world really worked. "Come on, John," he said, his voice oozing the kind of fake reasonableness that politicians use when they're trying to convince you that screwing you over is actually for your own good. "You can't even cover dinner? What kind of man can't take care of his family?" The way he said "man" made it clear he had some very specific opinions about my masculinity, or lack thereof. That was rich, coming from someone whose entire life had been bankrolled by mommy and daddy. Victor talking about being a man was like a fish giving swimming lessons to a shark. The guy had never faced a real challenge in his life, never had to choose between paying rent and buying groceries, never had to work a double shift just to afford basic necessities. But I didn't take the bait. Instead, I reached into my wallet, my worn, 3-year-old wallet that was held together with hope and determination, and pulled out 2 $20 bills. The leather folder was still sitting there in front of me, that obscene total still glaring up at me like a middle finger made of numbers. I placed the money carefully on top of the bill, making sure everyone could see exactly what I was doing. $40. Enough to cover my sparkling water, the small salad I'd ordered as an appetizer, and a generous tip for the waiter who was probably questioning his career choices right about now. "This covers what I ordered," I said, my voice steady and clear enough to carry to every corner of the Venetian room. No shouting, no dramatics, just a simple statement of fact delivered with the kind of calm certainty that comes from finally doing the right thing. I slid the leather folder back across the table with the kind of deliberate precision you'd use when returning something that never belonged to you in the first place. The sound of leather against marble seemed to echo through the Venetian room like a judge's gavel, final and absolute. Those 2 $20 bills sat on top of that ridiculous $4,000 bill like David facing down Goliath, except this time the little guy wasn't planning on sticking around for the fight. "This covers what I ordered," I repeated, making sure my voice carried to every corner of the room. I wanted everyone to hear this, wanted them to understand exactly what was happening here. For 3 years, I'd been the silent partner in this twisted family dynamic, the guy who paid the bills and kept his mouth shut while they treated him like hired help. But that John Mercer was done. Finished. He'd clocked out for the last time. The reactions around the table were like watching a slow-motion car wreck. Margaret's face had gone through more color changes than a mood ring, cycling from shocked white to angry red, and settling on something that looked like she'd swallowed a live wasp. Her perfectly manicured hands were gripping her champagne flute so tightly I was genuinely worried she might shatter it and cut herself, though knowing Margaret, she'd probably find a way to bill me for the medical expenses. Victor was sputtering like a broken engine, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to find words that would restore his authority in this situation. The golden boy wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he considered beneath his social station. His face was flushed with the kind of indignation that comes from a lifetime of getting your way and suddenly having someone refuse to play by your rules. Elise just looked confused, like someone had changed the channel in the middle of her favorite show and she couldn't figure out what was happening. Poor little princess probably couldn't comprehend that someone might actually refuse to fund her family's lifestyle. In her world, people like me existed solely to make people like her comfortable, and the idea that we might have opinions or, God forbid, boundaries was completely foreign. But it was Claudia's reaction that really got to me. My wife, my goddamn wife, was looking at me like I'd just announced I was joining a terrorist organization. Not with concern, not with understanding, not even with anger that might suggest she cared about what had driven me to this point. No, she was looking at me with pure, undiluted embarrassment, like I was a stain on her designer dress that everyone could see. "You're ruining everything," she whispered, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "These people are important, John. They have connections, influence. Do you have any idea what you're doing to my reputation?" Her reputation. Not our marriage, not our relationship, not even our financial situation, her reputation. Because apparently, in Claudia's mind, the most important thing about this whole situation was how it would look to the people who'd just spent the evening laughing at my humiliation. "John." Margaret's voice cut through the low murmur of confused conversations that had started up around the table. When I looked at her, that artificial sweetness was completely gone, replaced by the kind of cold fury that probably made grown men weep. "I think you're forgetting yourself. This is a family celebration, and families take care of each other. Families take care of each other. Right. The same family that had just toasted to everyone except me. The same family that had spent 3 years making it crystal clear that I was about as welcome as a root canal. The same family that thought nothing of sticking me with a $4,000 bill for the privilege of being publicly insulted." I looked her straight in the eye, really looked at her, maybe for the first time since I'd known her. Margaret Kingston, the grande dame of this twisted little dynasty, the woman who'd raised 3 children to believe that money could buy anything, including human dignity. She was used to intimidating people, used to getting her way through sheer force of will and social pressure. But something in my expression must have told her that her usual tactics weren't going to work tonight. "You already ruined it," I said, my voice calm and steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "You ruined it the moment you decided I wasn't worth basic human respect. You ruined it when you thought you could buy my humiliation for the price of dinner." The young waiter was still standing there, poor kid, looking like he wished he could disappear into the marble floor. His eyes kept darting between me and the bill, probably trying to figure out if he was about to witness a full-scale riot in the middle of the Grand Marcellus's most exclusive dining room. I almost felt sorry for him. He was just trying to do his job, and instead he'd gotten a front-row seat to the complete meltdown of a marriage. Around the room, conversations had stopped entirely. 40-something people were pretending to be fascinated by their coffee cups and dessert plates, but I could feel their attention like heat from a bonfire. Some of them looked uncomfortable, probably recognizing that they were witnessing something genuinely ugly. Others seemed almost entertained, like this was the best dinner theater they'd attended all year. Cousin Patricia was actually taking pictures with her phone because apparently my personal crisis was worth documenting for social media. Uncle Robert was shaking his head with the kind of disapproval usually reserved for teenagers caught shoplifting. And Great Aunt Millicent was clutching her chest like she was having palpitations, though knowing her, It was probably just another bid for attention. But none of that mattered anymore. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't performing for these people. I wasn't trying to impress them or win their approval or prove that I was worthy of sitting at their precious table. I was just being honest, and it felt like taking the world's deepest breath after being underwater for way too long. I turned to face Claudia one last time, looking at this woman I'd thought I loved. This person I'd bent over backward to please and support and protect. She was still beautiful. That hadn't changed. The expensive dress, the perfect makeup, the jewelry that probably cost more than most people's cars, it was all still there. But underneath all that polish, I could finally see what had been there all along. Someone who valued appearances more than authenticity, status more than love, money more than basic human decency. You know what the really sad part is? I said, my voice quiet enough that only she could hear. I actually thought I was building something with you. I thought all the sacrifice, all the humiliation, all the times I bit my tongue and smiled while your family treated me like garbage, I thought it meant something. I thought it was love. Tears were starting to form in her eyes, but I couldn't tell if they were from sadness or just anger that her perfectly orchestrated evening was falling apart. John, please, she whispered. We can work this out. Just pay the bill and we'll talk about it later. Don't do this here, in front of everyone. Don't do this here. Don't embarrass the family. Don't make a scene. The same old song, just a different verse. Even now, even after everything that had happened, she was more concerned about how this looked to other people than about what it meant for us. That's when I knew, with absolute certainty, that there was no coming back from this. This wasn't just about money or family dynamics, or even respect. This was about two people who had fundamentally different ideas about what marriage was supposed to be, what love was supposed to look like, what it meant to be partners in life. Without raising my voice, without making any grand gestures or dramatic declarations, I turned and started walking toward the door. Behind me, the Venetian room erupted into chaos. Voices collided like bumper cars at a county fair. Gerald stammering something that might have been an apology, Elise demanding to know what was happening, Victor calling me a coward, Margaret's voice rising above them all like a conductor trying to regain control of an orchestra that had completely lost the beat. But none of it mattered anymore. With each step across that marble floor, I felt lighter, like I was shedding invisible chains that had been weighing me down for years. The chandeliers overhead seemed brighter, the air seemed cleaner. Even the ridiculously pretentious classical music piping through the restaurant's sound system sounded almost cheerful. The maitre d' looked up as I approached the exit, his expression carefully neutral in the way that only comes from years of dealing with wealthy people's drama. I hope you enjoyed your evening, sir, he said politely, probably following some script about how to handle guests who were clearly fleeing a family disaster. Actually, I said, surprising myself with the genuine smile that spread across my face, I think I did. The cold night air hit my face like a baptism as I stepped out of the Grand Marcellus, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could actually breathe. The contrast was incredible, from the suffocating atmosphere of crystal chandeliers and fake smiles to the honest chill of a Tuesday evening in October. Even the city sounds seemed cleaner somehow. The distant hum of traffic, the click of high heels on sidewalk, the normal noise of normal people living normal lives without the artificial drama of trust fund politics. I walked to my truck, my beat-up, honest-to-God working man's truck that had never seen the inside of a country club garage, and sat there for a moment, just processing what had happened. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, replaced by something that felt almost like relief, liberation. Whatever it was better than the sick knot that had been living in my stomach for the past 3 years. My phone started buzzing before I even got the engine started. The first text came from Claudia at 11:47 p.m., just as I was pulling out of the restaurant's valet parking area. Come back. We can fix this. Fix this. Like it was some minor misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with the right words, and maybe a strategic apology. Like I hadn't just discovered that my wife and her family saw me as nothing more than a well-trained ATM with legs. By the time I got home to our apartment, my apartment, really, since I was the one paying for it, my phone was lighting up like a Christmas tree. Text after text, call after call, a digital avalanche of Kingston family damage control that would have been impressive if it wasn't so pathetically predictable. Claudia's messages started reasonable. Please come home so we can talk about this like adults. But as the night wore on and I didn't respond, they got progressively more desperate and then downright nasty. By 2 a.m., she was sending me novels that read like manifestos written by someone having a complete mental breakdown. You're being ridiculous, read one particularly charming message. It was just a dinner. You're acting like we asked you to donate a kidney. Grow up. Just a dinner. $4,000 was just a dinner to these people. That was my rent, utilities, car payment, and groceries for 2 months. But to Claudia, it was pocket change that I should have been happy to throw around to maintain her family's lifestyle. Then came the guilt trips. Mom is devastated. Elise is crying. You've ruined everything for a family that welcomed you with open arms. Welcomed me with open arms. Right. The same family that had just publicly announced I wasn't welcome at their table. The same family that had spent 3 years treating me like an unwanted house guest who couldn't take a hint. But my personal favorite was the message that arrived at 3:17 a.m. You're a pathetic coward who can't handle being part of a real family. No wonder your own parents are embarrassed by you. That one actually made me laugh out loud, sitting there in my darkened living room with a beer in my hand and the late-night talk shows playing on my ancient TV. Pathetic coward. Coming from someone who'd never worked a day in her life, never faced a real challenge, never had to choose between pride and pragmatism. Claudia calling me a coward was like a trust fund baby calling a Navy SEAL soft. But the real show started the next morning. Margaret's contribution to the chaos was a single text message, sent at exactly 8 a.m. like she was punching a time clock. You embarrassed this family. I hope you're proud of yourself. Short, sweet, and absolutely dripping with the kind of moral superiority that only comes from a lifetime of never facing consequences for your actions. Margaret was furious, but not because she'd hurt someone or behaved badly. She was furious because someone had finally called her out on her bullshit in front of witnesses. Victor's message was longer and predictably condescending. I never thought you were good enough for Claudia, but I at least expected you to be man enough to take care of your responsibilities. Guess I was wrong about that too. Real men don't run away when things get tough. This from a guy whose biggest challenge in life was deciding which country club to join for the summer season. Victor talking about being a real man was like a goldfish giving swimming lessons to a shark. The kid had been handed everything on a silver platter since birth, and he had the audacity to lecture me about responsibility. Elise's approach was different. She went for the emotional manipulation angle. John, I don't understand why you're being so mean to our family. We've always tried to include you. Mom spent weeks planning this dinner, and you ruined it for everyone. Please just apologize and make this right. Always tried to include me. I'd been included the way a court jester is included in a royal feast, present for entertainment value, not as an actual participant. And the idea that I should apologize for refusing to bankroll my own humiliation was so backwards it made my head spin. But the message that really got to me came from an unexpected source. Gerald, Claudia's father, the man who'd spent 3 years sitting silently while his wife turned family gatherings into blood sport. His text arrived around noon, and it was different from all the others. John, I should have spoken up years ago. I should have defended you when Margaret went too far. I'm sorry. You didn't deserve what happened last night, and you don't deserve the messages you're probably getting today. I failed you as a father-in-law, and I failed you as a man. I'm sorry. That one actually stopped me in my tracks. Gerald Kingston, acknowledging that his family's behavior was wrong. Gerald Kingston, taking responsibility for his own cowardice. I had to read it 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. But even Gerald's apology came with a gentle suggestion that maybe I should consider working things out with Claudia for everyone's sake. Because even the family member with an actual conscience couldn't quite bring himself to admit that maybe this marriage was fundamentally broken. Meanwhile, the rest of the family was apparently conducting a full-scale campaign to make me look like the villain in this story. I found out later that Margaret had spent the morning calling relatives and family friends, spinning the story to make me look like an unstable lunatic who'd had a psychotic break over a simple dinner bill. According to Margaret's version of events, I'd flown into a rage and stormed out like a madman after they'd graciously offered to let me contribute to the celebration. The fact that I'd been calm, quiet, and completely reasonable in my response didn't fit the narrative she was trying to create. so she just ignored those inconvenient details. By Wednesday afternoon, I was getting calls from people I barely knew, distant relatives, family friends, even some of Claudia's sorority sisters from college, all trying to mediate the situation and convince me to be the bigger man and apologize. Apologize? For what? For refusing to pay $4,000 for the privilege of being publicly humiliated? For finally standing up for myself after 3 years of being treated like garbage? For having the audacity to expect basic human respect from my wife's family? The really amazing part was how quickly they all rallied around the narrative that I was the problem. Not Margaret, who'd delivered that cruel toast. Not Victor, who'd questioned my masculinity. Not Claudia, who'd smirked while her family tore me apart. No, I was the villain because I'd refused to play my assigned role in their twisted little drama. But here's what none of them understood. I didn't give a damn about their opinions anymore. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't trying to win their approval or prove my worth to people who'd already decided I wasn't worth their time. I wasn't performing for an audience that had never wanted me on stage in the first place. Instead, I did something radical. I ignored them. Every text, every call, every attempt at guilt, manipulation, or emotional blackmail got the same response. Nothing. Radio silence. The complete absence of John Mercer caring about Kingston family drama. And you know what? It felt incredible. I went to work on Wednesday morning like nothing had happened. Tommy and Dave and the rest of the crew noticed I seemed different, but they didn't push for details. Working guys understand that sometimes a man needs to work through his problems with a hammer and some honest sweat, and they respected that. It was Dave who finally asked the question that was probably on everyone's mind. You seem lighter today, John. Like somebody lifted a piano off your back. Everything okay at home? I thought about that for a minute, really thought about it. Was everything okay at home? My marriage was probably over. My wife was sending me text messages that alternated between threats and pleas. My in-laws thought I was the devil incarnate. My bank account was healthier than it had been in months because I wasn't funding anyone else's lifestyle. You know what, Dave? I said, driving a nail home with more satisfaction than any nail had ever deserved. I think everything's going to be just fine. And for the first time in a long time, I actually meant it. 3 weeks later, Claudia finally showed up at the apartment. Not with an apology, not with any acknowledgement that maybe her family had crossed a line, but with what she probably thought was a peace offering, a bottle of expensive wine, and that particular smile she used when she wanted something from me. I was sitting at the kitchen table, going over invoices for a bathroom renovation I'd just finished, when I heard her key in the lock. She still had her key, of course. Changing the lock seemed a little too dramatic, even for me, though I was starting to think maybe I should have gone with my gut on that one. Hey, stranger, she said, setting the wine on the counter like she was presenting a diplomatic treaty. She looked good. She always looked good, but there was something different about her demeanor. Less confident, maybe. Like she wasn't entirely sure of her welcome, which was a first in our relationship. Claudia. I didn't get up from the table, didn't stop what I was doing. 3 weeks ago, I would have jumped up to greet her, would have asked about her day, would have done that whole dance of pretending everything was normal even when it clearly wasn't. But that John Mercer was gone, and I wasn't interested in bringing him back. She hovered near the kitchen island for a moment, probably waiting for me to fill the silence with the kind of nervous chatter I used to default to when things got uncomfortable. When that didn't happen, she tried a different approach. I brought that Cabernet you like, she said, gesturing to the bottle. Thought maybe we could talk. The Cabernet I like. Right. It was a nice touch, except I'd never expressed any particular fondness for expensive wine. That was her thing, not mine. I was perfectly happy with beer or the occasional whiskey, but Claudia had this weird assumption that everyone shared her taste for overpriced alcohol. Talk about what? I asked, still not looking up from my paperwork. The bathroom renovation had come out better than I'd expected, and Mrs. Chun was so happy with the work that she'd already referred me to 2 of her neighbors. Real work, honest work, the kind of success you build with your own hands instead of inheriting from daddy. Claudia moved closer, and I could smell her perfume, the same expensive stuff she'd been wearing since we met. It used to make me think of good times, romantic dinners, the early days when I thought we were building something together. Now it just smelled like money and entitlement. About us, she said, settling into the chair across from me. About what happened at Mom's birthday dinner. About how we can fix this. There was that word again, fix. Like our marriage was a broken appliance that just needed the right technician to get it running again. Like 3 years of systematic disrespect could be resolved with a conversation and some expensive wine. I finally looked up from my invoices, really looked at her. Claudia was beautiful. That had never been the problem. She had the kind of classic features that photographed well, the kind of style that came from a lifetime of having access to the best of everything. But sitting there in my modest kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of my working-class life, she looked oddly out of place. Like a museum piece that someone had accidentally left in the wrong exhibit. "I don't think there's anything to fix," I said quietly. "I think we just finally saw what was always there." Her face fell, but she recovered quickly. Claudia had always been good at adapting her approach when the first strategy didn't work. "John, honey, I know mom can be difficult, but she's family. You can't just cut off family because they hurt your feelings." Hurt my feelings. Like what had happened at that restaurant was some minor social awkwardness instead of a calculated public humiliation. Like Margaret's toast was just an unfortunate choice of words instead of a deliberate attempt to put me in my place. "Your mother announced to a room full of people that I wasn't part of your family," I said, my voice still calm, but with an edge that made Claudia shift uncomfortably in her chair. "Then you all expected me to pay $4,000 for the privilege. That's not about hurt feelings, Claudia. That's about basic human dignity." She waved her hand dismissively, the same gesture she used when I brought up practical concerns like our budget or my work schedule. "It was just money, John. It's not like we couldn't afford it. Just money." And there it was, the fundamental disconnect that had been poisoning our marriage from the beginning. To Claudia, $4,000 was just money because she'd never had to work for it, never had to choose between paying bills and eating, never had to understand the difference between earning something and having it handed to you. "We couldn't afford it," I corrected her. "I couldn't afford it. You've never paid for anything in your life, so you don't get to decide what we can and can't afford." That hit home. I could see it in the way her jaw tightened, the way her perfectly manicured fingers drummed against the table. Claudia didn't like being reminded that she was financially dependent on me, probably because it interfered with her narrative that she was doing me a favor by being married to me. "Fine," she said, switching tactics again. "Then let's talk about boundaries. We can set some rules about family dinners, about who pays for what. We can make this work, John. We just need to communicate better." Boundaries, rules, communication. All the buzzwords from the self-help books and marriage counseling articles she'd probably been reading for the past 3 weeks. But here's the thing about boundaries. They only work when both people respect them, and the Kingston family had spent 3 years proving they didn't respect anything about me. "What boundaries would those be?" I asked. "The boundary where your mother doesn't publicly humiliate me? The boundary where your brother doesn't question my masculinity? The boundary where you don't smirk while your family treats me like garbage?" Each question hit like a physical blow, and I could see Claudia flinching with every word. Good. Maybe it was time she understood exactly what her family's harmless teasing had felt like from my perspective. "They're just old-fashioned," she said weakly. "They don't mean anything by it. It's just their way." Their way. Right. Their way of systematically destroying my self-respect while making me pay for the privilege. Their way of making sure I knew exactly where I stood in their social hierarchy. Their way of reminding me that I was lucky to be included in their world, even as a second-class citizen. "And what about your way?" I asked. "What about the way you sat there and laughed along with them? What about the way you've never once defended me in 3 years of marriage? What about the way you're more concerned about your family's feelings than your husband's dignity?" That was the question that really mattered, and we both knew it. Margaret and Victor and Elise were always going to be who they were. Rich, entitled assholes who couldn't conceive of treating working people as equals. But Claudia was supposed to be my partner, my teammate, the person who had my back when the world got ugly. Instead, she'd been part of the problem from day one. Tears started forming in her eyes, but I wasn't moved the way I used to be. I'd seen Claudia cry before, usually when she wanted something or needed to get out of trouble. It was just another tool in her toolkit, like the expensive wine or the practice smiles. "I love you," she said, her voice breaking in all the right places. "I know I've made mistakes, but I love you. Doesn't that count for something?" Love, the word that had kept me trapped in this toxic situation for 3 years. The magic spell that had convinced me to endure endless humiliation because surely love would conquer all. But love without respect isn't love. It's just dependency wearing a prettier name. If you loved me, I said, you would have stood up for me the first time your mother made one of her little jokes. If you loved me, you wouldn't have let your family treat me like hired help for 3 years. If you loved me, you would have been as angry about that toast as I was. She opened her mouth to argue, probably to explain why her family's behavior wasn't really that bad, why I was overreacting, why I should just forgive and forget like a good little husband. But I held up my hand to stop her. I've already talked to a lawyer, I said quietly, about separating our finances, about protecting my business assets. I'm not asking for alimony or trying to take anything that's yours. I just want to make sure that what's mine stays mine. The color drained from her face. You're divorcing me? Over one dinner. One dinner. Like it had all started and ended with Margaret's birthday celebration. Like there hadn't been 3 years of systematic abuse leading up to that moment. Like I was throwing away our marriage over a single incident instead of finally acknowledging a pattern that had been there all along. I'm divorcing you because you've never been my wife, I said. You've been their daughter who happened to live in my apartment. You've been their representative in my life, not my partner. That was the truth she couldn't argue with, couldn't explain away or minimize. For 3 years, Claudia had been loyal to her family first and her husband second, and we both knew it. She sat there for a long moment, probably trying to find some angle that would change my mind, some approach that would convince me to go back to being the doormat I'd been before. But something in my expression must have told her that ship had sailed. The family's not going to understand this, she said finally, as if their understanding was somehow relevant to my decision. The family's not invited to understand it, I replied. This is between you and me, and frankly, their opinions stopped matching the moment your mother decided I wasn't part of the family anyway. After she left, taking the expensive wine with her, naturally, I sat in my kitchen and really looked around at what I'd built. It wasn't much by Kingston family standards. The apartment was small, the furniture was practical rather than stylish, and nothing in it would have impressed the country club crowd. But it was mine. Every piece of furniture, every appliance, every monthly payment. All of it earned through honest work and careful budgeting. No trust funds, no family connections, no handouts from mommy and daddy. Just a working man building a life one paycheck at a time. Over the next few weeks, word started getting around about what had happened at the Grand Marcellus. The Kingston family's version of events made me sound like an unstable lunatic, but funny thing about small communities, people talk, and the truth has a way of coming out. The waiter who'd served our table that night happened to be the nephew of one of my regular customers. He'd seen the whole thing, heard Margaret's toast, watched the family's reaction when I refused to pay their bill. His version of the story was a lot different from the one Margaret was telling at her charity luncheons. Soon I was getting calls from people I barely knew, contractors and business owners and regular folks who'd heard about the guy who finally stood up to the Kingston family. Some of them had their own stories about dealing with entitled rich people, their own experiences with being treated like servants by people who'd never worked a day in their lives. Good for you, became a common refrain. About time someone put them in their place. My business started growing faster than I'd ever expected. Turns out there were a lot of people in town who respected someone who stood up for themselves, who chose dignity over money, who refused to be bought and bullied. Word of mouth led to new contracts, bigger projects, opportunities one never would have had if I'd stayed trapped in the Kingston family orbit. Even Gerald started calling me, quietly, asking for advice about standing up to Margaret's more outrageous demands. The man was finally learning that there was life beyond his wife's iron-fisted control, that maybe he didn't have to spend his golden years walking on eggshells in his own house. I should have done what you did years ago, he told me during one of our conversations. I should have drawn the line, set some boundaries. Maybe if I had, Margaret wouldn't have turned into such a... He paused, probably realizing he was about to call his wife something that wouldn't sound very gentlemanly. Tyrant, I suggested helpfully. I was going to say difficult person, but your word works too. 6 months later, I was sitting in my new office, a real office, in a building I'd bought with the profits from my expanding business, when I got a call from an unexpected source. Victor Kingston, the golden boy himself, calling to ask if I'd be interested in bidding on some renovation work for one of his property developments. I know things ended badly with you and Claudia, he said, his voice lacking the usual condescension. But you do good work. My investors are asking for quality contractors, and your name keeps coming up. It was tempting to tell him exactly where he could stick his business offer. But I learned something important over the past few months. Success is the best revenge, and I was finally, truly successful on my own terms. I'll send you a quote, I said. But just so we're clear, this is a business relationship. I work for people who respect me, and I expect to be treated like a professional, not like hired help. Understood, Victor said. And for the first time since I'd known him, he actually sounded sincere. That night, I sat on the porch of my new house, my house, bought and paid for with money I'd earned myself, and thought about how different my life had become. No more Sunday dinners where I was the entertainment. No more surprise bills for other people's champagne. No more apologizing for having the audacity to expect basic human decency. I'd learned something powerful that night at the Grand Marcellus. Love without respect isn't love, it's servitude. And self-respect isn't something you can buy with $4,000 or any amount of money. It's something you earn by knowing your worth and refusing to accept anything less. The $3,980 bill hadn't been a cost after all. It had been the price of my freedom, and looking back, it was the best money I never spent.